I think there's something in our American DNA that's very uncomfortable with the idea of a king. And frankly, that's understandable, right? The pilgrims came over basically of saying, no, we don't want to worship the king's religion. We want to worship as we see fit. That's why religious freedom has always been important for Americans in the United States of America. Because we left that of saying, no, it's not up to, you don't get to decide how we worship, it's we get to decide. So we literally declared independence from the authority of a king and from the rule of a king. If we're honest, we need to recognize that things like rejecting authority and rebelling against authority, it's not just an American sentiment. That sense of obedience to authority, not very popular. Submit to anyone or anything above me or over me, I don't think so. Surrender, not on your life, not on your life. We'd rather fight and declare, it's our freedom. I get to do what I want to do. Some of you may have seen the movie many years ago, Princess Bride, right? It was a combination of a comedy love story. It had pirates and royalty. And there's a great scene when Wesley they're on the run. And a group of soldiers on horseback with their swords, they surround him and they yell and they say, he holds up his sword and tells Wesley, surrender. And Wesley looks up and says, what? You wish to surrender to me? Very well, I accept. And there's that part of us that says, we don't like the idea of us surrendering, but certainly if you want to surrender to me, that's fine. I'm all fine with that. We're all very okay with others surrendering to us. This idea of us surrendering and humbling ourselves before another, not in actually our fallen nature. That's the result of fallen nature. Which brings me back to a king. This Sunday is the feast of Christ the King. And I'd like to focus on three things in light of the readings. The first is this: we have a king who promised to come in the first place. Second, that he did come and he did conquer. And third, he will come again to bring about the fullness of his reign, of his kingdom. So he promised to come, he came and conquered, and he will come again just as he promised for the fullness of his reign. Let's begin with the first. He promised to come. In the first reading from the prophet Ezekiel, Ezekiel was sent to them, and he's speaking to a people of Israel who are in disarray. Right, the Babylonians have just conquered them, and now they're exiled. Some were killed, some fled, some were made slaves. And this is the word to the people, and that he's saying. He said, I myself will look after my sheep. I will tend the flock. I will rescue them from where they are scattered. Now, the Israelites also were in a place they were like, this is like a not again moment. A not again, like this happened 100 years ago. The Assyrians did this to us, and now the Babylonians do this. Not again, not again. So you can imagine the consolation of these words to the prophet Ezekiel. I myself will shepherd you. I will come for you. I will bring the scattered sheep back in. Now, usually when God makes those promises, right, he sends messengers, right? He sends Moses or Elijah. He sends Elisha or King David. But no one really expected that it would be God himself, even though it seems to point to that. No one expected that God himself will come. So you can hear, when you hear these words from the prophet Ezekiel that says, the lost I will seek out, the strayed I will bring back, and the sick I will heal. You see, it's a mystery, as God's not only he's not going to use a messenger, he himself is going to come. And all those are qualities of Jesus, right? Healing the sick, bringing back the lost. Our brothers and sisters, the king promised he would come, and he did come. Which means, second, that he did come, and he is a king and a good shepherd. And he did conquer. What are the four enemies that he conquered? Sometimes it's helpful just a reminder, right? He conquered sin and Satan, sickness and death. Those are the four enemies he conquered. Sin and Satan, sickness and death. Let's talk about that. No longer do we have to be a slave to sin or Satan. That's actually a freeing message for every human. You don't have to be a slave to sin or to Satan, who literally, again, sin is from fallen nature. The evil one tempts from without. But that reality of there's an interior battle that goes in every human, not just Catholics or Christians. It doesn't matter. Any human has this. That's a universal feeling of this interior battle. St. Paul talks about this, right? We don't always do what we want to do, what we want to think the best and speak the best and act the best. We don't always do that. There's something happening within. But when Jesus came, he said, No longer do you have to live that way. No longer do you have to live in pride and vanity, being more concerned about what others think or focused on your opinion. No longer. No longer do you have to live in selfishness. No longer there's another way to live with my help and my grace. No longer do you have to be a slave to dishonesty that leads people in roads where they just feel so stuck because they've been lying their whole life long. No longer do people have to be a slave to material things that don't satisfy in the first place. No longer do they have to be stuck in the bondage of things like lust or self-indulgence or laziness. You don't have to be a slave any longer through the grace and the goodness of God. No longer do you have to be a slave to bitterness and unforgiveness and vengeance, which will never satisfy. Remember that story, The Count of Monte Cristo? Alexander Dumas wrote that book, and it was also a movie. It's basically a story of someone who was so wronged at a deep level. The whole rest of the story is I'm going to get back in a very creative and destructive ways. I'm going to get back, and you're going to get what yours is. And the whole story is about that. But while he was in prison, he met a priest who was also in prison who said, you have to give away that bitterness. It's never going, the vengeance will not satisfy. It's a thing that fuels and it just keeps going. He's like, you got to get rid of your bitterness. And it's at the end of the book that he realizes that all of his vengeance that he took, again, it just led to a deeper darkness. And it was only when he brought that back ultimately to the Lord. How beautiful it is that Jesus conquered our propensity to sin and Satan. No longer do we have to be a slave to sin and Satan. That's the first thing he conquered. He also conquered the reality of sin and death. You know, I'm watching that series, The Chosen. Kevin and I are watching it sometimes in the rectory. I'm watching it for a second time, and it's about it's kind of like a mini series on Jesus. If you haven't watched it, highly recommend it. It will help you love Jesus and to see just this reality. So see him with fresh eyes, like the case of his healings, and then you realize, why were so many people attracted to Jesus? How did his name spread so quickly? Because of the number of healings. Person after person he would heal. And there was a very powerful scene with him, with a leper approaching him. And a leper had heard about one of his healings. And you see a leper approaching Jesus, and they're all like, Jesus, he's a leper, stay away. And, you know, it's almost like COVID times, right? They're putting on their mask. Don't breathe his air. He has foul air. And this man is desperate. And he's crying out to Jesus, Jesus, please, please, if you will it, I know you could heal me, please. And you see Jesus coming over to him and touching the leper of all things. He says, I do will it, be healed. And they see the healing. The leper sees it. Everyone else around sees him healing the leper, and people are like, what just happened? What just happened? You see, he came to conquer things like sickness. And this reality of the people, the blind could now see, even someone blind from birth. The crippled now walk again, wherever Jesus was. You have people, the paralyzed person, you have the deaf hear. You have, in this reality of the healings of Jesus is what spread. He actually conquered the reality of sickness. But you and I know, or even the reality of death. He raised Lazarus, who had been dead 4 days. Impossible. Someone dead 4 days, raised back to life. Jesus did it. And yet the reality is, you and I sometimes ask that question. Well, Jesus, if you're the king and you conquered things like sickness and death, what about my loved ones? And maybe you might even ask yourself, what about me? Some people are experiencing sickness or cancer or some suffering of their back or arthritis. Lord, what about me? If you conquered sickness and even death, what about me? Some years ago, I remember talking to someone, and maybe it was after their funeral, and it's not uncommon that the responsorial psalm is Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. And I'll never forget what a woman told me. It was a mother. She says, you know, when I hear Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. And then she said to me, I want my son back. I can't say, I want my son back. I want my son back. What do we say? What would we say to her? Obviously nothing. You love a person right there. You love a person right there. But I do want to say this. Have you ever known someone who's been healed in this life? Someone who's been healed? I bet you if we were to look back in our life, have you ever known someone you heard about, everybody's praying for a baby and a baby makes it? By the way, baby Thomas Dominic is making it little by little. He's kind of working his way. It's still a little precarious, but we're still praying for Thomas Dominic that I asked you to pray for a few weeks ago. Have you ever known someone who came out of a car accident and was almost untouched and not affected? You ever met someone whose life was prolonged a lot longer than you had expected? I would say out of 100 people, I would bet many of us could raise our hand and say, I can tell you a story. My brothers and sisters, the reality of things like sickness, and when Jesus healed the sick, those miracles, he didn't just come to take away all sickness. They were signs. They were signs that point to the ultimate healing in eternal life. You see, the blind man still died. The reality of the crippled man, although he could walk, he still passed away. Lazarus still died. They were signs. Signs that point to the reality of eternity. Of the one who even took something as tragic as death. And also the Father who sent his Son, who suffered, was rejected, beaten, brutally beaten, crucified awfully, and died so we might have life again. My brothers and sisters, when we know that, it changes things. He came to conquer things like sickness and death. But again, we do have miracles in this life, and they still happen. I can tell you stories, but they're signs. Signs to point that how he conquered in eternal life, things will be complete. And the more we know that, it changes our perspective that he promised to come, he has come, and again, he will come again. We say a thing in the creed. Will you please repeat after me? Ready? He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. He will come again in glory to judge the living and dead. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. You see, the church has an understanding where they explain it like Christ's reign has come. It has. We may not always see it, but his reign is not out there. If you look for it, like, where is God? Where is God's reign out in the world? And we look out in our cities or in our homes or our families, and we're like, I don't know, we see God very clearly. Where is God? And yet his reign is not out there. Where is his reign? It's from the inside out. Those who have humbled themselves ultimately before God. You see, the prideful won't enter heaven. They won't enter heaven. Prideful, selfishness, you can't enter heaven with pride or focused on yourself. You won't make it. You won't make it when he comes again to judge the living and the dead. Selfishness has no place. That would be very foreign. A follower of Christ selfish? No place for that. But when he comes again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and he will come again in glory, all will submit to his reign. I don't care if you're an atheist, if you're I want to do, it doesn't matter. At that point, all will kneel, and if you don't kneel, you will kneel. Because of the King of Kings who comes in glory, who has given us everything. He created us, he loved us, he offered us salvation that has to be received. This reality, and Jesus tells this parable of we don't just have to be humble and selfless, but he will divide them like sheep and the goats, and he uses that image of a shepherd. And at the end of time, he will say, for those who fed the hungry and clothed the naked, those who were concerned about others, they will receive the kingdom. Those who neglected it, there's no place for you here. There's no place. They will be cast off, as Jesus said, to eternal punishment. Because the selfish and the self-indulgent and those who live for themselves, even if they didn't recognize it, when you rejected and did not care for others, you did not care for me. And yet those who did do it, they recognize in a new way. When you helped someone in need, especially the least among us, you didn't just do it to them. You did it to me. And Jesus is preparing us to say, when I come again in glory, and there will be a concrete time in history, whether it's 10,000 years from now or tomorrow, when he comes, all of humanity, past, present, will be under his reign, in the fullness of reign. You know, it's interesting, C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist before, he wrote the story of Chronicles of Narnia. And at a certain time, the quote-unquote, the White Witch had power, and it was always winter there. Without the reign of Aslan, it was always winter and always cold. And what was their expression that he wrote so with a beautiful wisdom? He said, they described Narnia when the White Witch was in charge. It's always winter and never Christmas. You imagine that would speak to children, wouldn't it? It's always winter and never Christmas. But in the end, when Aslan comes, when Jesus comes again, all the snow melts, all the cold goes away, and there's the warmth of the light of the sun. And it's a foreshadowing ultimately of his reign when he will come again in glory to judge the living and dead. Those who have not served him will not be part of the kingdom. Those who have loved, those who are humble, and lived those words, thy will be done, selflessness, and cared for the least among us, they will be welcomed. My brothers and sisters, we have nothing to fear about anything that goes on in the world. I'm not worried or anxious about anything that goes on in the world. There will always be a rebellion against him, and people living for themselves. And yet at the end of time, there's no corruption unexposed. No one gets away with anything, individually no one gets away with anything in any way, right? Individually, if we ever had hurts, and they're like, well, that person got away, or why is this person, they've done bad things and they've never gotten caught. There's no not getting, at the last judgment, all will be exposed. All will be seen. But those who have been living according to the reign, thy will be done, selflessness, and caring for the least among us, they are the ones to be welcomed to the kingdom. It will come. Always persevere. How beautiful it is that he is a good king and a good shepherd. How can we not be open to his reign among us right now? How can we not further his reign by, I'm a follower of God, and we're called to live differently and love differently. May we be counted among his when he comes again in glory to judge the living and the dead.